Gravar. Dear Lee and Marta, we are here today to start our part of the program. So I take this opportunity to say goodbye, to say hello to you and Lee. And today we're having Professor Patricia Sampaio. She's an expert in regulatory energy issues. And so we decided here in Brazil to divide it in two modules. Today we're speaking about energy on the regulatory side of it, focusing on electricity. And tomorrow we'll move to the module and we're going to talk about fuels, and we're going to focus on non-conventional gas, the shale gas, and liabilities associated with big oil spills. Tomorrow we have experts from the regulatory agencies, to come to speak to us, and we have an attorney who is specialized in environmental liabilities. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Patricia, and she will provide us with her lecture on energy law.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thank you to you all, especially to Professor Romulo Sampaio for having me and the opportunity to give this lecture. So the idea today is to give you an overview on Brazilian electricity regulatory framework. As we have an international audience, I thought it would be a good idea to start with an overview of our sector. So I'll give you some figures and data on how our market works. And then on the second part, we will move to the legal framework on electricity here in Brazil. Okay? So with regard to the first part, overview, may I start by telling you that in generation, Brazil has over 2,800 power plants. We have as an operational capacity more than 123 million kilowatts. Our country is mainly based on hydropower potential, so 65% of total generation is provided by hydroelectrical plants, whereas 27% are thermal power plants. And we also have wind power plants and biomass, and so we are mainly a hydropower country. We also have the federal government having a huge stake of this generation. 35.5% of the total generation in Brazil is provided by the federal government through its holding company and subsidiaries, which is Eletrobras. And we also, this is an important figure for us here in Brazil, as we will see that the government and governmental state-owned companies play an important role in the Brazilian generation market. If we talk about the 10 major generators in Brazil, just to give an idea of how our market is organized, we will see that the first, the second, and the third players are federal state-owned companies that belong to the Eletrobras group. Then, in the fourth position, we have Companhia Energética de São Paulo, which is a company controlled by the state of São Paulo. So also a state-owned company, but not a federal company, a company owned by the state of São Paulo. Then we have Tractebel, which is a private group. Then in the sixth position, we have our binational company, which is Itaipu. Itaipu is the result of a treaty between Brazil and Paraguay. Brazil owns 50% of Itaipu, and this is the 50% part of Brazil responds to the sixth position in total capacity generation. Then we have CEMIG, which is also a state-owned company that belongs to the state of Minas Gerais. Then we have Petrobras, which is the oil and gas company, the federal state-owned company, at the 8th position. So Petrobras is also a very important player, not only in the oil and gas market, but also in the electricity market. And in the 10th position, we have also a private group. This is to give you an idea that of the complexity of the Brazilian generation market, where we have not only federal assets, also assets and companies owned by several states of the country, and also private investors. With regard to transmission, Brazil has one of the most complex, if not the most complex, transmission grid of the whole world. Our grid covers almost all of the country. Then we have a system of a centralized dispatch, which means that generators, transmissions, and end users of electricity are all organized under an association that is managed by ONS, which is the National System Operator. Only 3.4% of total of the country is not connected to the central grid. These are isolated small systems, especially in the Amazon region. It is too expensive to interconnect Amazon. It's not an area full of very populated. So in the Amazon region, we have small systems that have thermal plants and small transmission systems for that population in those localities. But out of these, all the country is interconnected, as you can see in this figure. This means a lot of complexity. Just to give you an idea, transmission lines in Brazil, they amount to 95,400 kilometers, and it is all managed by the National System Operator. Also in transmission, the federal government plays a very important role. The federal holding company, Eletrobras, holds more than 56% of the whole grid of total transmission lines. But after 1999, the country started a privatization program, but not to the pre-existing transmission lines. Those were not privatized. What we have is that in an effort to enhance and enlarge the grid, we had the government, the federal government, undergoing concession bids for the construction of new power plants. So these public bids had as their object the purpose of constructing, operating, and maintaining new transmission lines, and that explains why throughout the years 2000 we experienced an important enhancement of our grid. As regards distribution, we have in Brazil, distribution is considered to be a public service and is either done by private companies or state-owned companies. Most of this service is rendered by private companies. We do not have competition on the distribution level, at the distribution level. What we have is our exclusive concession agreements by geographical areas. So no competition within the same area. We have more than 60 distributors company, and 67% of the whole investments are of private investors, and only 33% of distribution remains to be state-owned companies. So, as we will see in a few minutes, it was in the distribution, at the distribution level, that we had most of our concession program being successful. This was not like that before the years 1990s, but we had a privatization program that led to most of our assets now being managed by private companies, but under concession agreements, because since distribution is a public service in Brazil, it cannot be totally privatized. The title of this service belongs to the federal government, but the federal government is entitled through public bids to give the performance of the service to private investors under long-term concession agreements. So this was to give you an overview of our system. With regard to the legal framework, we should start by saying that after the 1930s, back in the 20th century, electricity, the regulation of electricity is a federal duty. It's a federal service. Infrastructure of electricity in Brazil was developed and constructed mainly through public investments. So we have in 1945 the incorporation of CHESF. CHESF is a major hydroelectricity generator in 1945. Then in 1957 we have the incorporation of another major player in hydropower generation, which is Furnas, and both CHESF and Furnas nowadays belong to the Eletrobras group, which is the holding company of the federal government that owns assets and provides services in both generation and transmission lines. So companies controlled by the state use it in the past to also hold most of distribution assets. Here we have to make a distinction because Brazil is a federation. So whereas we had with relation to generation and transmission most assets belonging to the federal government, in the past we had most of distribution assets and distribution companies belonging to companies controlled by the states of the federation. The two main exceptions were the distributors of Rio and Espírito Santo, which are two states of the federation, and this explains why these were the two companies to first be included in the concession program of the 1990s as a consequence of the Brazilian privatization program. Because as they were federal and the regulation is also federal and the conceding power was the federal government, it was easier to have these companies privatized. Whereas to the other distributors companies, we had to have the states under their state privatization programs to decide or not whether they would or would not concede these distributions to be performed and the service to be delivered by private investors. So this is a short history of how the system was developed, but one of the main legal mark in this history is the Constitution, the Federal Constitution of 1988. And with regard to electricity, we have some very important sections of the Constitution talking about electricity and things that are necessary to generate electricity. So, first of all, we must see that hydropower potential to generate electricity is a federal asset in Brazil. It means that regardless of who owns the river, if the river is owned by the federal government or by a state of the federation, the potential that river has to generate electricity is a federal asset, and therefore if an investor wants to exploit this asset, it has to have a license or a concession or some sort of authorization from the federal government, because it is a federal asset. The same thing applies to oil and gas reservoirs that are important for generation of electricity. Oil and gas reservoirs are also federal assets, regardless of who owns the property. The property may be private, it may belong to whoever it is. The reservoir is a federal asset, a federal good. And also, with regard to electricity, the Constitution provides that the federal government is responsible for the delivery of electricity to end users. It may do that directly, or it may deliver the service through authorizations, permissions, or concessions to be granted to private investors. But there is a major duty that the government, the federal government, must have electricity delivered to the population. And also, according to Brazilian law, transmission and distribution of electricity are considered to be public services. So this brings many constitutional duties to the federal government, and the concessionaires or that happen to be exploiting that service. State has a constitutional duty to secure supply, to provide good service quality for end users, and also to have low tariffs to the users. As it is a public service, there is a whole bunch of rights to end users, which are duties for the federal government that it may seek either directly or through the concessionaires to whom it gives a concession agreement to exploit these services. It is also important to mention that being a public service, the federal constitution also requires that if the government decides to have this service exploited by private investors, it has to promote a public bid in order to decide, which is a public auction, in order to decide who will be granted the right to exploit the service. Following the Federal Constitution of 1988 and the driver of our economic constitution that says that whenever possible, most goods and services shall be rendered by private investors, we had the country decided to undergo a privatization program during the years 1990s. So under this program, we had the federal distributors that used to be state-owned companies, like the Espírito Santo distributor and Rio de Janeiro distributors, to be conceded to private investors. As I mentioned earlier, these companies belonged to the federal government, and after public auctions were then transferred to be exploited by private investors. And most companies owned by the states of the federation also were conceded to private investors under states' privatization programs. Although not all of them, some distributors remain to be companies owned by the states of the federation, but only a smaller part. As we saw in the first part of the presentation, 63% of the whole distribution in the country is now being operated and managed by private investors.